Hey there, welcome to Board Game Hot Takes, the podcast where we give our immediate reactions to the hottest board games just minutes after playing them. My name's Tim.
And this is Chris.
We're going to depart from our normal format for this episode, and instead of a hot take review, we're going to list our top 5 gateway games. We're also going to follow up with a double take review of Terraforming Mars, where we revisit a game that we've reviewed in the past and tell you how our feelings have changed on it. So let's get started into the conversation, Chris, with gateway games. You picked this topic. You suggested it anyway. Was there anything that particularly led you to want to speak about this topic, about gateway games?
Yeah, I thought this would be a fun topic because, for anybody who's a game enthusiast, I assume, we've all had that experience where, you got a friend who you want to try games, right? And you always want to have more people to play with. And you bust them out and you're like, it's always like, you're like the guy who picks the restaurant, where you're like, okay, God, I hope everybody likes it. And on those occasions where someone, does pick it up and, maybe they even run with it. Maybe it becomes a new hobby for them, or it's something exciting. That's thrilling for the person who introduces them as well. Like, for example, I think, you have introduced people, including me, to gaming, and I imagine that probably feels pretty good having someone get into it after you introduce them. On the other hand, you can bring a game that, doesn't quite make the mark, or, God forbid it, really stinks. And, you potentially turn someone away, or, at least you don't have as good a time. So I thought it would be fun to talk about what games you can bring to the table with someone who hasn't played before that would be both fun and relatively simple to learn, but that also introduce the spirit of hobby strategy board gaming. So nothing too light, but something that brings that feeling but doesn't overwhelm you.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to talk to the term gateway game a little bit here, because I think I've seen some people giving it a little bit of a negative connotation, saying that calling it a gateway game means that you only play it until you can play different games or better games. And I don't think that's the case. As you mentioned, the point of a gateway game, or what we're calling a gateway game tonight, is something that is a good fit to bring someone else into the hobby. It's not always true for everybody. It's kind of a general definition, because I've introduced some people who I felt like were just ready into like mid-weight or mid to heavyweight Euro games on a first game, and they got in and they enjoyed it. Certain people are just like game. They're ready to try something. Just can sense when somebody's got the mind, the will to get in and tackle something with a lot of rules. But that's not true for everybody. So, so one person's gateway game may be a midweight Euro and somebody else's may be a little bit lighter. On the other hand, I also have friends or family members that have gaming for years or decades even, that they just prefer this weight of game. So it's not necessarily that this was their gateway and then they're ready to move on to something else. In some cases, they just like this weight. It's just a more comfortable space for them to be in. I think it's important to call out that these are not necessarily games that are only starters or only games that someone starts with. They may be the right fit for somebody long term, and all the games that I picked at least are also still games that I enjoy playing. So even though they're maybe lighter than I usually pick, they're still games that I have a good time with.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because when I was coming up with my list, I actually thought of, what's the right term? Is it gateway game? Is it medium weight game or lightweight game? And in reality, I don't think that the weight of the game is necessarily the first thing I thought about when I actually looked at the games that I picked. Because you can have a game that's a midweight game or even a heavyweight game that's so intuitive or so engaging that it's a great gateway game. That's something that, because when we've all played games where the rules just sort of click and you get it, and it all makes so much sense that you can take somebody who's never played a strategy game before and you can teach it to them in 5 minutes. And I would give examples, but I think that's what we're going to do next.
Okay. I was going to ask you, did you have any, kind of heavier games on your list? But I guess why don't we just jump right into the list and kind of hear what we both think are really great games to introduce new players to. And so we'll call them gateway games tonight. So Chris, why don't you start with your number 5? What's your number 5 gateway game?
My number 5 was a fun little game called Donut Drive-Thru. And I will actually look up the publisher, because I'm forgetting it off the top of my head. But when we move on, I'll look it up and I'll come back to that. But it's really an amusing little game. And this one I would say is pretty lightweight. but it's also fun. I mean, it's a game that I enjoy. It's a game that if I wanted to sit down with my wife or my son and play something that was quick, you can probably play a game of it in, 10, 15 minutes. And the rule set is extremely simple to learn. It's also a fun game in that it's got some kind of, clever, amusing cards. The artwork on it is incredibly simple, but it's amusing. It's funny. You kind of chuckle a little bit. In fact, there's one, I forgot the name of the card, but there's all these different donuts that you have to make, and they have funny names like was it matcha matcha hey or something like that. And half of the time that I find myself, going with Dunkin' Donuts or a Krispy Kreme or something, and we get a donut, and I make some kind of joke that brings me back to donut drive-through. So, and ironically, this is not even a game that I picked out. It was a game that you and I inherited from a collection of games that we got, and just kind of went through them and picked out the games we wanted to keep. And this is one of the ones that I kept, and I'm glad I did because I've come back to it a number of times.
So you've introduced some newer players that haven't played games to this one.
Yeah, and mostly family. This one I've played. I played with family a number of times, and I've also played it with a couple folks who are not gamers but have had a fun time playing it with me too.
I remember you taught this one to me one time a while back, and I think we were playing just kind of a quick filler before a game night. It seemed like a clever little game. It's got a little bit of almost a worker placement mechanism, doesn't it?
It does. It does. You place your donuts in different. There's a learn a recipe, cook a recipe, and then that's what you're trying to do. And the worker placement is you have a number of donuts that you can use, and you have to place your donut on one of each of those squares, the cards, in order to do that action.
Okay, so cool. So kind of maybe a good way to introduce some of the basic concepts of worker placement.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I had not thought about it that way, but absolutely, that's exactly what it is, and it's an incredibly simple version and easy to understand version of worker placement. And I went back and looked up the information on this game, and the publisher was Grail Games, designer was Ikagaya, and artist was Heiko Gunther.
This was probably a Japanese game originally and probably got distributed to the US. So I think Grail was the US distributor. The original publisher, Haoya, it looks like, the Japanese publisher. All right, well, cool. Thanks, Chris. I bet that's one that most of our listeners have never heard of. I don't think it gets talked about a whole lot. So that's an interesting choice. Well, let me jump into my number 5. My number 5 is going to be Azul. Azul is an abstract tiling game. It's very popular. A lot of people know it. But I found that it's really easy to get someone into that hasn't played strategy board games. The rule set's pretty straightforward, quick teach, and I think people pick up the strategy pretty quickly. I usually help walk them through the first round or two of scoring, and then they can kind of run on their own and go for it. One of the things you'll find as a recurring theme on my list is that I think any of these games that work really well to teach someone for the first time are games that really even new players have a shot at winning. So Azul is obviously, with any game, you're going to have a little bit of a leg up if you know the game better, you know some of the strategy. But I've often played Azul with my 9-year-old daughter. The first couple times I played, she beat me at it. I taught a new player just a few weeks ago, Jen, who's one of the hosts on our podcast. Her new boyfriend, we've all been vaccinated, so we're finally kind of getting to see each other in person. And he's not a gamer, and so we taught him Azul, and he picked it up right away. Ended up winning his first game. So I like that. There's really anyone could get the strategy if they pull the right tiles, and it's quick and easy to teach. And I still like going back to it and have a good time with it even after dozens of plays. You haven't played Azul, have you, Chris?
No, I've never played it before, but I'm familiar with it enough to know the concept, and I gotta say, it's a pretty game. It's a nice looking game. It's abstract, but very, very beautiful.
Yeah, nice big chunky tiles too, and the theme is that you're helping to build like a palace in Portugal or something like that. So it's got a little bit of theme tied on there. I don't think I've ever even thought about introducing you to it because I know you're not an abstract fan, so I don't know if you'd have much fun with it, but it's good for new players.
Well, in one of the things I think that makes it good for new players is that I think components are important, because a game that has card games, of course, if it has good art, or if you have a game like this that has nice components and it looks pretty, and it's gaming can be a very tactile thing. Whereas if you've got other types of games where it's very abstract and say the pieces are not terribly engaging, even if the gameplay is terrific, I think it's a little bit more, it's a little bit easier to bring somebody in when you've got something that's physically engaging as well
Yeah.
as mentally.
Yeah, totally agree on that. And Azul was designed by Michael Kiesling, and the publisher, I believe, was Plan B Games. There's a few other publishers listed here, but I think that's the most recent one. So yeah, that's my number 5. That's Azul. So what's your number 4?
My number 4 was a game that you and I played back right at the very beginning of my gaming career. And that is King of Tokyo, which was published by, I don't even know what to make of this, but it says Yellow plus 31 more. I'm not sure what
No,
that
it's
means.
just yellow. Yeah, I think it's because there's publishers all over the world. So if you
Okay.
click in, you're going to get all the regional distributors and stuff like that. But yeah, I think yellow is the original publisher in that one.
Okay, gotcha. And designer was Richard Garfield. And this is a game that's great for a number of reasons. One, that it has some really nice graphics to it. The Similar to Donut Drive Through, and I think I'm seeing a pattern in my preferences here. It's got some really amusing, really tongue in cheek art. Like it's got all the standard monsters that you'd see in a monster movie, kind of the classics. But they're done in really funny ways, like the Cthulhu-esque character is this really goofy looking sea monster, and you've got a an alien that is attacking, but it's in this weird bubble helmet, and I think there's like a giant penguin or something like that. So there's some wacky stuff going on there. So it's a lot of fun to look at. But on top of that, it's a game that's simple to learn. This is another one that I would call mid to lightweight. And the nice thing, or one of the nice things about it, is that you can even simplify the rules beyond the basics. It really depends on what age you're playing it with. So there's some very simple changes you can make in the gameplay just by using some house rules that can simplify it for even younger children. In fact, I think I played it for the first time with my son when he was probably about maybe 6 or 7. So it's something that you can make very simple. And it also has that nice tactile aspect that I was talking about before that's great for a new gamer. And in this one I think is particularly also good for younger gamers. It has standees. It doesn't have miniatures. And I think adding miniatures would actually make it even more fun. But just having the fun art on the standees and on the cards and whatnot, I think is a really nice touch and makes it really enjoyable.
Yeah, this is a great game to introduce people to because it's got a mechanism that's recognizable, and that's the kind of Yahtzee dice thing, right? You roll the dice, and then you can roll up to 2 more times and keep the dice that you want to, and push your luck to see if you can get the roll you want. So yeah, this has always been a great one to introduce to new players. It can still be fun. I feel like this is one of those games that I rarely go back to, but if it seems like the right group to introduce it to, I'll be happy to play it. Now, Chris, you mentioned house rules here. So remember when I was asking you if we should talk about house rules on the podcast, and you said I don't have anything to input there. Just lock that away because we're going to come back to that in another episode. But yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, but you're right.
And did you know? So King
You're
of
right.
Tokyo, Richard Garfield is the designer, but he's the guy that designed Magic the Gathering. He basically created that whole card system, which is one of the most famous games of all time, tabletop games of all time at this point.
Oh, right on.
King of Tokyo, I think, was his big follow-up. He's done several well recognizable designs since then. This was kind of his big stepping away from Magic and putting out a tabletop game, and it's been a huge hit and continues to be a huge hit. So obviously it strikes a chord with a lot of people.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to it also is that there is a follow-on game to this one, King of New York, which honestly, between the two, I would go with King of Tokyo. I like some of the additional art and the characters they added for King of New York, but I also think they added a couple of gameplay elements. There's the use of buildings and a couple of other things that I thought made it a little bit clunkier. So if you're looking for a game to start out with, a beginner game, I think that you're better off with King of Tokyo.
100% agree on that. Like King of New York seems like a fun step up, but basically once you're getting into the, kind of the level of mechanisms and the complexity there just seems to be more fun and interesting games to move on to. Well, my number 4 is Trekking the World. So Trekking the World is a fairly recent game. We actually did review it in a recent episode, so feel free to take a step back if you want a longer review of it. But Trekking the World kind of takes the place of, I think Ticket to Ride has been a common gateway game for a lot of people. It's something you introduce people to. It's got a fairly small rule set. Trekking the World gives me a lot of the same feels of Ticket to Ride, but I think it's a much more interesting game. I think that every turn is more enjoyable. What you're doing, the actions you're doing on those turns are more enjoyable than Ticket to Ride. And the reason I compare it to the two is because it does have some of the same mechanisms. It still has the idea that you're drawing cards and trying to get sets, or essentially enough to match to kind of go to a destination and then turn in that set for cards. So there's a lot of the same thing of you're just every turn you're collecting cards and then trying to turn them in, just like Ticket to Ride. But this one has some other fun little mechanisms that are going on. There's not those just boring wasted turns of just draw two cards like Ticket to Ride has. There's always something you're doing. You're moving, you're picking up these souvenir tokens, which you're competing for people with the number that you've got. There's just a lot of fun little mechanisms, but it's just as quick and easy to teach as Ticket to Ride. I taught it to a group of people at my work who are, again, not gamers. They've played a couple of games with me, but 6 of us played a game. No, I think it was a 5-player game. 5-player game took about 50 minutes with the teach. So it's a quick game. Everyone picked that up right away. They all had a good time with it and, could kind of play their own strategy. So great game to introduce new people to. It's get, a little bit bigger than some of the games we've been talking about. It's got the full board. It's got a lot of the kind of Euro type of components that you'd see, the wooden cubes and the meeples. So it's fun to, kind of get people into that world, but it's quick and easy to teach. So I think that one's a really good fit. Let's see, Trekking the World was designed by Charlie Bink and the publisher was Underdog Games.
And I feel so shallow that I keep bringing up the graphics in these things, but man, talk about beautiful art. Like every single one of the cards in this game looks like a painting, like a beautiful work of art. And I think didn't Adam, either you or Adam brought this up in the recent episode where we talked about favorite art. Am I remembering that right?
I think he mentioned it as like one of his
Oh, the runners up.
Yeah, like a runner up for him. So yeah.
Yeah, that's honestly, if I had been more familiar with this game before we did that episode, I may have thrown this one in there because man, it is pretty to look at. I love the art in this game.
You haven't played this one, have you, Chris?
I have not. I'd like to. There's also the companion game, not companion, but it's another variation on this game called Trekking the National Parks, which I have not played. Is that simple and similar to this game?
As far as I know, it is. I've never played Trekking the National Parks, but my understanding is that was the first one that came out, and then this one just kind of refined a few mechanisms and changed the setting for it, basically. So I don't know exactly how close they are, but I know they're in the same universe. All right, so that was my number 4. What's your number 3?
My number 3 is one that may be a little surprising to folks because it's not a lightweight game. It's Wingspan, published by Stonemaier Games and designed by Elizabeth Hargrave. And this is the game that I had in mind when I said before about sometimes you have a game that is so intuitive that it transcends weight almost. And I think this is one of those games, and it really is a full package. There is a very nice production on the game. The art is really nice. There's worker placement aspects to it. I mean, there's set building. I mean, there's all kinds of pieces of this game that introduce you to a variety of different mechanisms from strategy gaming. But one of the things that I think really sets this game apart, beside just the intuitiveness and the ease of learning, is that in this game, you are essentially playing almost by yourself. I mean, obviously you can have table talk and people can discuss the things that they're doing, and it can be social in that sense. But largely, the actions that you're taking are on your own player board. You're not really interfering with anybody else. There's obviously an opportunity to mess with somebody if you draw a card that they wanted, but generally that's not something that you're going to be doing very strategically if you're hurting somebody else. And so it's a very friendly game. It's a very harmless game in that sense. And so I think that is something that can be, for a lot of people, a more attractive way to start gaming, especially if you're not that used to games and you go into a relatively heavy game and you're potentially intimidated a little bit by the rule set. Having people beat on you just isn't that fun. So I think this is a game that remedies that by keeping it, keeping it friendly and keeping it, like I said, relatively nonviolent.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that does help a lot of people, especially if they're learning a game, it better. When there's when there's kind of meanness in games, if one person knows the game better, they just they can kind of run you down. Thinking of our game of Eclipse last week is a great example, but yeah. I agree with that. I think that's a good point for introducing someone to a game. Now, have you actually taught this game to somebody that wasn't a big gamer yet?
Yes, I've taught it to several people, and I've actually gotten universally positive responses. And in fact, my wife, who is not even a gamer, not even, I mean, she'll play with me occasionally, but I would really consider her to be generally a non-gamer. Frequently brings this up as something that, with other people who are not gamers, saying, "Hey, you should try this. It's a lot of fun." And,
Mm.
and another thing about it that makes this attractive, I think, is that, and I think this is almost the intent when Elizabeth Hargrave designed this game, was that the subject matter is so different and so interesting to folks who are not necessarily interested in space games or fantasy games. It brings an aspect to games that I think is really attractive because it's not something that normally someone would think of as that geeky game material.
Yeah, totally. 100% on that. The reason I asked you whether you taught it is because I haven't had a lot of good success teaching this to newer gamers. They do pick it up, but I find that the mechanism of starting your cube in the farthest left open space in a row and then moving it backwards and triggering everything, that has not been very intuitive. So I've had a hard time getting people their heads wrapped around that, and it ends up me helping them, for the first 2 3 rounds of the game, getting through it. So it's always felt like a clunky teach, but then every time I get the same thing, I get really positive reviews. People love it. I've had several new gamers who, after we finished playing, even though I felt like they were struggling through the rules, they're like, "Where can I buy this?" And then ended up
Yeah.
picking it up. So it is interesting that the game really does bring a lot of joy to people. To me, it just feels a little harder to teach than I want to start with, but obviously people don't seem to mind that. Maybe they don't mind that it takes them a little while to get their head around the rules.
Yeah, it's been my experience that once you get, and I think you're absolutely right. I agree with what you said. But once you get past the first round or two, when people are going, "Oh my good, what do you mean move back to the left?" Once they do it once or twice, the confusion kind of fades away, and it flows more easily. So yeah, I think if you can stick with it for a round or two, it's a big winner.
Yeah. All right. So my number 3 is Sushi Go, and Sushi Go is a drafting game, and it's a great introduction to drafting games. Obviously, drafting is used in a lot of modern board games today, but it's just a fun, quick experience. It's easy to teach. Again, even having played it dozens of times at this point, and it being quite a bit lighter than I like, I'm always happy to go back and play a game with it. It's easy to get. I think you can play up to 6 players with it. Maybe it's 6 or 8, but I think it's 7. You got a big group of people, can teach quickly, can play quickly. I've had this in almost a party type of environment and had, 6 people having cocktails, having a good time playing this game, and it worked. So I think in some situations this is a really great game to bring in. I've also taught it to kids, 8 9 year old kids, and they picked it up and were playing on their own pretty quickly. So I think this is a great example of a gateway game that teaches people some of the general concepts that you find in other games, but still fun for people that have played a bit too.
Now, are you talking about Sushi Go or Sushi Go Party?
So they're basically the same. Sushi Go is the original version of it, and it basically has one set of cards that you play with. Sushi Go Party expands that a little bit by basically giving you a variety of cards that you can mix and match to create the sets, right? So if you're playing Sushi Go, I think you have 8 types of cards in there, and you're drafting and trying to get these little, sets. And basically the cards, based on each different type of card, it has different point conditions. So like one of them might be, if you get 2 of them in your hand at the end of the round, it's worth 5 points. Another one might be you're going to get 1 point for every one you have in your hand, or some escalating point structure. So they all have kind of little different mechanisms for getting the points and how you get value out of them. So when you go to Sushi Go Party, it's a bigger box and there's something like, I don't know, maybe 20 different cards. And so you just take a set of 8 every game and mix and match them. And so it gives you more variety. It changes it up. I obviously, if you're going to play this a lot, I would absolutely recommend Sushi Go Party, but I don't think it's necessary. And I think the role that it fills, like I actually gave away my Sushi Go Party because I just wasn't playing it that much anymore. If I was going to pick this up as an intro game for somebody or recommend it, I would just go Sushi Go, because I think there's enough other great games to kind of transition to that. Once you've played this 10 times or so, you're ready to move on to something else, and then it's still a fun, light filler from time to time, and you just don't need all the variety in there if you're not going to be playing it all the time. But anyway, they're both great. They're both I think they're both really good gateway or entry weight games to bring
And
in.
the art actually reminds me quite a bit of Donut Drive-Thru. In a good way. In a good way. It's very amusing.
Always coming back to Donut Drive-Thru.
I love donuts.
No, it does. It has that cute little anthropomorphic sushis,
Right.
which is not something I ever thought I'd see anywhere. So it's adorable.
After you play Sushi Go, you can then play Donut Drive-Thru and play with small, cute anthropomorphic donuts.
Nice. More anthropomorphic food in our game. That's what we need. All right, sounds good. So that was my number 3. What's your number 2, Chris?
All right, my number 2 is probably my biggest deviation from the simplicity factor, and that is Star Realms. This is a game that we've talked about in a previous show, and it is one of my all-time favorites. It is published by Wise Wizard Games, previously White Wizard Games, and the designers were Rob Doherty and Darwin Castle. And this is a game that I forget where this comes from. It's like from the game Go or something like that. The saying, minutes to learn and a lifetime to master. And I feel like this game is great because it does have a relatively simple, basic rule set that you can learn very quickly, but there's so much depth in the cards, especially when you start adding in the different expansions, that you can play it for years, and you're always learning new little combos and things that you can do. I mean, you and I still play this game, on the app almost daily, and I never get bored of it. I don't think I've ever gotten bored of this game. And but at the same time, like I said, you can learn this very quickly. And I've taught this game to people. And I think if there's anything that is where I said this game is sort of at the boundary of the weight zone for a newcomer, it's that I think I've seen people get a little bit intimidated by the variety of different actions on a card. And if there is one shortcoming with this game as a gateway game, it's that it makes a huge difference if you know the cards very well and you know the strengths and the weaknesses. So it's not so much that the rule set is difficult to understand, but each of the individual cards really does it has its benefits, and there's some real strategy that you can put together. So unfortunately, it is not an amazingly good game for someone who is very good at Star Realms if you're trying to introduce somebody who is not very good at Star Realms or is new to it. But if you're willing to, kind of step back and let them win a few games, or not try too hard, I think the payoff is really worth it. And then if your friend who you're teaching it to puts in the effort and learns the game and gets a little better at it, you can go to a great deal of depth in this game. And I'll just add, because I feel like I need to say this about every game that I'm talking about, the art is great. It's a lot of fun to look at as well.
Yeah, right on. You're right. I mean, this is a game that's pretty easy to teach. It's very basic, but it's hard to. There's some strategy things. I think the thing that stands out the most to me that was not obvious for any new players I've taught it to is how important scrapping is, and that's just kind of a basic deck building mechanism that you need to cull your deck. You need to hone it, and so that you can make sure you're drawing the right cards. But new players tend to look at those scrapping cards and say, like, why would I destroy my own card in my deck? It's just not an intuitive strategy that somebody new is going to get into. That being said, yeah, I mean, I think it's okay even if you're better than somebody else. You don't even necessarily have to handicap yourself. Sometimes there's just opportunities for them to get the right cards up and buy the most expensive cards they can and get some lucky hands. And so there's still an opportunity for a new player to learn. But I've definitely found some excitement from players that I taught this to for the first time when they weren't into games before, and just what they could do with it, and the concept that they get to make that choice every turn of what cards to buy. And I got this combo of cards that came up, and they all they synergize together. And so I definitely think it brings some fun to people who are just getting interested in games. The one other thing about this game is that it is a 2-player only game. At least I think there's some expansions that you can expand that a little bit, but so that makes it a little harder to do in a group setting. And then that also leads to a head-to-head game where there's a more experienced player versus a less experienced, can lead to that factor of, I'm going to win every time. If you're playing with a game that's got 3 or 4 players, there's more of an opportunity for that success to be spread out a little bit. But obviously there's situations where you're just going to be head to head with somebody, you're teaching one friend a game for the first time. This was one of the first games I taught to you, Chris, I think. I don't remember.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember you loved it. Like, this was one of the first ones where I showed it to you, and like that week you went and bought it. You bought a deck yourself and started playing it on the app and stuff. So obviously, hey, it worked for me to introduce a new player.
Well, you mentioned the app, and actually, that's one other thing that I would add on this game is that is actually a great way to teach the game to somebody, because what I found is that when you actually bust the cards out, it can get a little bit fiddly. It can get a little bit easy to, well, and because the cards do such a variety of different things, it can be easy to forget like what order you have to do something in, and that can get a little bit challenging. But I think all that goes away in the app because of the rules enforcement mechanism. So I think that's actually, if you're interested in trying this game with a friend, a nice way to do that is with the app, if you're willing to both sit there with your iPads or what have you. Although the cards are more tactile, and if you're willing to tolerate the fiddliness of it, I think that can be fine too.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, cool. So that was your number 2. My number 2 is Parks. Parks was designed by Henry Audubon, and the publisher is Keymaster Games. Parks is a nice intro to kind of resource collection and management, something that you find in a lot of Euro games, but it's got a very simple mechanism. It's just essentially this path, and you've got 2 little workers. Each player has 2 hiker meeples, and you're just moving up this path, and wherever you move to, you get those resources. But there are some fun choices to make about how far do you want to go forward, and you're passing up some other resources to do that, but you want to rush and get to some before somebody else. But it's a very simple mechanism to teach. It's very simple to show them, here's the objectives, or the parks cards that you want to visit at the top of the board, and those are the resources you want to collect. So just work your way on collecting those resources. And taught this to several new players, and they've all enjoyed it. And the production here is mind-blowing to somebody who has not been introduced to a modern board game. You look at something like Parks, taken out of the box with the beautiful card art, the chunky wooden components. It's such an upgrade from all of the family weight board games that you find in big box stores that people know. So, just that alone, the tactile feel, it's another game where it's not a traditional fantasy or sci-fi based theme. So it's going to bring some people in that maybe didn't realize that those existed. So yeah, this has been a big hit with everyone I've taught it to. I think it works really well. Taught this to, younger kids as well, 8, 9, and they picked it up pretty quickly. Taught it to adults that totally loved it, and it's a game that I and some of my regular gaming friends still like to go back to on a regular basis.
I think this is another one of those games that has the principle of, there's less attacking.
Yeah.
This is another one of those more gentle games, and that kind of goes with the theme of the national parks. And I think that's another reason why this game is good too. It's a little bit one of those little less violent games.
Yeah, except that, man, the fight for that camera, I don't know, they can get kind of out of hand.
Yeah, and everybody always says, I'm going to buy a park. It's like, you can't buy a park, man. Come on.
Yeah. All right. So let's get down to our number ones. Chris, what's your number 1 gateway game?
My number 1, I am going to go crazy old school and say Settlers of Catan. And the reason I'm saying that, going back to one of the great granddaddies, is that for one, even though I've kind of moved on from it and I don't play this game very often, it's still a good game. I mean, it's a fun game, it's a good game, and it's been around long enough now that it actually has some name credibility, that even people who are not strategy gamers generally have heard of Settlers of Catan. People think of it as sort of a heavy version of Monopoly or what have you, which makes it a little bit easier to get it to the table because people have heard of it. I mean, the number of times that I brought a game, even the best game, something like Wingspan to the table and said, here, there's something you got to try. They sit down and look at it and go, this rule set, what in the world are you talking about? What is this thing you're trying to do to me? I found that that's not the case with Settlers of Catan because, again, people recognize the name and it's something that they can sort of, that they can relate to, and it doesn't strike them as quite as shocking. A good solid game, not my favorite. It's not one that I would bust out any time, all the time, but it's certainly one that if I had someone that was interested in playing a new game and new style of game, I would break this out and introduce them, and I think it's good for that. And although probably obvious and well-known, his publisher was Cosmos Games and the designer was Klaus Tuber.
Yeah, can I say one thing about this game? the most important decision that a player can make in the Settlers of Catan. Maybe someone will argue this with me, but that is, where do you place your starting cities? Because essentially from there on out, it's based on the dice roll. And obviously you can make some strategic decisions about, when you trade in your resource cards for, different types of buildings and where you build and things like that. But your starting cities are so important because that's where most of your production is going to come from through the game. So I've actually found that when teaching this to new players, you can walk them through the whole, like, hey, here's all the important decisions you have to make, and I start, then you pick, then this person picks, and it comes back to you. Or you could just set up the new players, pick the starting locations for them, and give them a little bit of an advantage. And you'll get the game running quicker. They'll get to experience the game, and then on the next play, they'll have enough information to be able to make some choices on that next play. But anyway, I find that with new players, that's a great way to just kick it off. And the game can be frustrating because if you don't make that early first choice, you realize you just, halfway through the game, you realize you just, essentially burned yourself for the whole game. So if you can help, you can handicap yourself a little bit. You can help everybody kind of try to pick evenly just by that one first decision, and then everyone can hopefully have a decent time playing it.
And then hopefully after that, they learn not to do that the next time. Hey, so what's your number one? I'm dying to hear it.
All right, so my number one is a recent new to me game. It's been out for a couple of years. It's the Quacks of Quedlinburg. This has been a pretty big hit in the industry recently. I believe it won the Spiel des Jahres a couple of years ago. The Quacks of Quedlinburg it's a push your luck game. It's got bag building. It's got a little bit of what you get in Star Realms, which is that deck building like feel, but it's bag building instead. So at the end of every round, you get to add some more things to your bag so that hopefully you're pulling them out later and getting the benefits that you need. Everyone I've introduced this to, and I've only had it for a few weeks at this point, so it's new to me. But everybody's loving it. My wife loves it. My daughter loves it. Again, we introduced it to a new friend who'd never played any hobby board games before. He had a great time with it. It's so easy to get taught, and it's so easy to just get into. It plays relatively quickly, 30 to 45 minutes, and it's a blast. And I'm still having a great time with it even after about a dozen or so plays. So this is a game for me right now. If I was going to teach anybody, hey, I want to introduce you to new board games, this is the one I would pick. It's not that pretty, but it is a blast and gives you some really fun decisions, and you really get to experience a lot of the mechanisms of modern board gaming with this relatively simple rule set. And it is very luck based. So, that could result in a bad game for somebody, but oftentimes it also means that they have a great shot at winning no matter how much you know the game. So it's a great gateway game, and something I'd be happy to teach to anybody that I wanted to get into the hobby.
Yeah, I'd love to try this game. This is one I have not played yet, but it looks like a lot of fun. And I have to admit, when you first mentioned this to me and Adam, I was a little bit, I will say, unimpressed by the concept, because I was picturing, which is unfair. But honestly, I was picturing it being goofier than it actually is. That I was actually picturing ducks. Okay, so I I didn't really get the concept. But actually, after you showed it to me, I looked it up, and it turns out that, and I think you had known this already as well, that there is a historic precedent for this. This is not something that is purely fiction. That this is a place where people were known for their quackery. So I think that adds just some historical interest to it.
Yeah, totally. This game is designed by Wolfgang Warsch, and it's published in the United States by North Star Games. I think it was originally published by Schmidt Spiel. But yeah, this game is great. If you don't have it, or even if you're a regular hobby gamer, you haven't played Quacks yet, I think you'll enjoy it. It's one of my favorite games that I've gotten to experience recently. Definitely not the weight that I usually am playing, but I'm having a great time with it.
What a list. That was fun. It's some interesting games we don't usually talk about a whole lot.
Yeah, for sure. That is the one thing about this type of conversation, is that we get to jump into some stuff we don't normally.
Yeah.
I think that'll wrap up our conversation on our top 5 favorite gateway games. We're going to do our double take review on Terraforming Mars right after this. All right, welcome back. So we're going to come back to a game that we reviewed on our very first episode of Board Game Hot Takes, and that was Terraforming Mars. So Terraforming Mars, you can go back and listen to episode 1 of our podcast if you want a full description and want to hear what our original thoughts were on the game back when we talked about it almost coming up on a year ago now. Chris and I had a chance to play it again tonight. Adam was with us on that first review. He couldn't make it tonight. So Chris and I are going to just kind of give you our thoughts on how has the game aged 33 episodes in. Have our thoughts changed on it? Did we like it any more, any less? How it feels different on a repeat viewing, so to speak. So Chris, why don't you start by just kind of filling me in? Do you remember, how you felt about Terraforming Mars on our last play for the podcast? And tell me a little bit about if anything's changed for you.
Well, I think the last time we talked about this, I already had a pretty well established view of this game because this is one that I had played a number of times, mostly with you. But at this point, I probably played it a few dozen times, and it's such a solid game. I came into it in that first review with a tremendously good impression of the game, and in this version, to the game we played tonight, I didn't feel any different about it. I felt like it was a fun game. If anything, it's been a while since we played it, and in fact, this was my game choice tonight. And I purposely wanted to play something that we had played before but hadn't played in a long time. And to the extent that any game gets boring, the more often you play it, this one, that little bit of time between the two games really did just make it fresh again. And I had a really enjoyable time playing it. We also added some new content this time. It wasn't particularly significant, but we did add some new promo cards, and we also added the Prelude expansion. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So that gets the game kicked off a little bit faster, and it adds some additional production at the beginning of the game that makes things move a little bit quicker at the beginning. And so I thought that was a nice addition as well. What about you? What did you think?
Yeah, so I think on our last review, I had even said at the time that this was my favorite game of all time, or I'd have a hard time naming something else that was more favorite for me. We played a lot of games since then, and I have fallen madly in love with some games that we've played and that I've had a chance to play a lot since then. And I would say that I still love my play of it. I still love trying to find the card synergies and that drafting every round and trying to decide what cards to buy and working my way up. But I think Terraforming Mars is losing its luster just a little bit for me. I think that I will still happily play it any time. There's a little bit about the pacing of it. And even with the Prelude expansion, I'll speak to that a little bit more. But with the pacing of it, the chance for someone to make essentially 2 actions every turn before passing to the next player, sometimes it can just drag a little bit. And I felt that a little bit tonight where, sometimes it just felt like a long time to get back around to my turn. And I already had my decisions picked. And, I think that's always been there. But I think that after just playing a lot more games this year and I think finding some games that really fit for me, this one's starting to feel just a little bit clunky, maybe showing its age a little bit. That said, I still love it. I think it's fallen out of my top 5 at least, but it's probably not too far out of there. So, would love to get it back and play some more. And, always playing online, which is, of course, what we always do before we review games in our current situation. I think that always adds some negativity to the game. So my in-person experiences with Terraforming Mars have always been better than our online plays of it, just because I think that, the extra fiddliness of trying to deal with the chits and the challenge of looking at the cards and see what they say. It just, it's one of those games that is not a good translation to tabletop simulator or online play, as much as some other games can transition pretty easily. So that might be part of it. So yeah, that's my general feel. I think it is starting to show its age a little bit, and I'm kind of just slightly, falling out of love with it.
You and I both have, I think we both have the big box expansion coming up that has the really super deluxe pieces to it. And I wonder if part of it has to do, certainly, pacing is completely irrelevant to the pieces you're using. But I think you're right. It is a game that needs to be felt physically. It has a big board. The pieces, if you get the expansion pieces or if you get the upgraded pieces, I think it really is a game that has a tremendous table presence. And you lose a lot of that when you get the TTS mod. Do you think you'd feel differently about it if you sat down and played it at a table right now with those big fancy new pieces and were able to slap them down on the board? And you think that would make you feel differently about it?
No, I don't. I think I'm looking forward to having them, and I am looking forward to plays with that big box and with the upgraded components. I also am going to be getting a lot of the expansions that I have not played with before, so I'm excited to try some of that other stuff out. I think what will benefit from playing in person is, I think the pacing will be a little bit easier. The ease of the user experience will be a little bit easier in person. So I'm looking forward to more plays of it. One other thing I think that maybe soured me just a little bit since the last time we reviewed it is I had always played with your copy, or we played online, but I purchased a copy after we reviewed it. And so because we haven't been able to game in person very much, and my wife has zero interest in playing this game, the only plays of it I've had of my physical copy has been some solo plays. And I did not like the solo experience very much at all. So I got a few plays of it. It was fun to kind of do that little puzzle.
Yeah.
But the problem with it, and this is something I really don't like when there's a solo experience, is that you have a very specific objective you have to meet. So you basically have to focus. There's certain cards that work well for raising the temperature, raising the oxygen, and getting ocean tiles out. And you have to focus on those. If you don't, you're going to lose the game. And that's the win condition. So I think if the solo mode had been a little less, you just have to terraform Mars within 14 rounds. If it had been a little bit more like the base game, maybe you're playing against Automa or something like that, I think I could have had a lot of fun with this game solo. But I think those solo plays of it just made me a little less excited about it. And I think that carried through a little bit to my current play. So I think if I can get back in person, play this with some friends, and we can get back to our old, super competitive plays of fighting over every greenery spot and who's going to place the city next in that optimal thing, and who's going to hit that temperature raise at exactly the right time. It has a lot of fun going for it. And I definitely had fun tonight. I mean, we had a really tight game. It was a cool ending to the game. We all had different strategies where you're going after. We had some tense moments in it. So there's fun in there for sure. I've just had games where when I think about what's a game I really want to play right now, and Terraforming Mars is not sitting at the top of my list at this point. And I think today's play, that didn't change it in a positive way. I think if anything, it made me a little less excited to get back to it. Still a great game, though. Let's talk about the Prelude expansion a little bit more, though. As you mentioned, basically the way the Prelude expansion works, I think it does add some other corporations and some project cards into the game. The mod that we played tonight had some other stuff, but I think some of them may have just been promo cards. So I'm not sure how much of that comes in Prelude. But the gist of the expansion is that there is a whole bunch of Prelude cards. Every player gets dealt 4 of them at the beginning of the game, and then they pick 2 of them to start their game with. And they're picking it at the same time they pick their starting corporation, and they get to look at their 10 starting card hands. So the idea is that you're going to pick 2 of these Prelude cards, each that have some kind of production on them typically. Like maybe one of them will give you 3 energy production to start with, and the other card that you pick would give you a city and 2 money production or something like that. So you're basically just trying to find a combo of things that'll kind of jumpstart your game a little bit. I like that a lot. I mean, I think it was great that it kind of kicked it off a little bit faster. I like that early choice, and it's just fun to have a little bit more to do the first couple rounds other than just trying to build some cards to get production running. What did you think, Chris? Is it an expansion you want to play with every time you play, or did it not matter that much to you?
I don't think it made a huge difference, but it did speed things up a little bit. And I agree with you. I think what you were suggesting, that this game does have a slow start when you play it the normal way. I mean, it's really hard to get that production built up, and this helps a lot. But essentially, it doesn't really add anything new in terms of the gameplay overall. And there's no new strategies.
Right.
It's basically new content that fits into the old framework.
Yeah.
So it's very similar for those who played the game. When you start out and you pick your corporation, it gives you some special resources, or it gives you a superpower or something like that. That's exactly what the Prelude cards do. They give you some kind of a resource, or some kind of something that you can take right at the outset that gets you started. So it's a very easy expansion to add into your play, but I don't think it's tremendously impactful. That said, I did think it was fun, so I enjoyed it. I think that if I was going to play it, again in the future, I would probably add that in as well, and also having the additional corporation cards and whatnot in there, I thought added some nice new choices as well. If the old cards are getting a little bit stale for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I don't think if I had this expansion, I don't think I would ever choose not to play with it. I just don't see a situation where I wouldn't play with it. So I think it's a great little expansion. There are some other expansions, Chris, that we haven't played with yet that do change the strategies, the available strategies quite a bit, change the game a little bit. So we'll have to dig into some of those at some point and see if they change for the better or for the worse. But I like that Prelude just kind of souped up the game a little bit without drastically changing it.
Now I'm curious, had you played the game since the last time when we reviewed it?
Just the solo plays that I mentioned. So no, I haven't played it multiplayer with anybody since then.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how how you feel about that in a little bit of time, especially once you get the big box version.
Obviously, I'm going to be excited to, once I get that thing, to bust it out and hopefully get it played with some people. Listen, I'm not saying it's a bad game. I just, as a comparison to my original review on it, I do feel like it's starting to become overshadowed by other Euro games of similar weight that I feel are just a little bit more streamlined and just feel a little bit fresher right now.
I'm curious, if there's any games in particular that you have in mind where you think, this is a game that does some of the same things that Terraforming Mars does, but say does it better. That if someone were looking for a game that would be a better choice, a more streamlined or more smoother play or what have you. Do you have any games in mind that would do that?
Yeah, I don't want to say that specific mechanisms that Terraforming Mars does that I've got something else I would recommend necessarily. Because I think Terraforming Mars has some unique things going on. The tableau building and the kind of central area control aspects of it, I think it's unique. A lot of people compare this to Underwater Cities, and I can understand that comparison, but I disagree. I don't feel like they feel like the same game at all. But Underwater Cities is one of those games where when I'm thinking of playing a 2 to 3 hour midweight Euro, that is a game that I would prefer to play today than Terraforming Mars, typically. Just because, I don't know, there's just some elements of it that just seem fresher and more fun, and I think just the pacing on it's a little bit quicker. So if you were asking for a recommendation instead of Terraforming Mars, maybe I would say Underwater Cities, but again, I don't think it replaces it or anything like that. And I think Terraforming Mars does its own things, and it does them in a really great way. So I would not recommend anyone replace this game. You should get it, you should play it, and see if it's for you.
But if you get it, get the upgraded pieces, because that is one thing that is bound to disappoint anybody, is when you open up that box and you realize, man, I just bought a big ass box of cardboard. You got to get the upgraded pieces.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the upgraded components don't include upgraded card art, so you're stuck with that.
Well, there you go.
All right, sounds good. Well, I think that will wrap up our double take review of Terraforming Mars. That will also wrap up the episode today. So if you have any thoughts on the games we mentioned today and would like to chat with us, feel free to reach out on social media. Otherwise, until next week, take care, everybody.
Take it easy, guys.